I am very much in support of the Prove It Act and am proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill. The Regulatory Flexibility Act, or RFA, seeks to reduce the economic impact of agency regulation on small businesses. When proposed rules are found to have a significant impact on small businesses, the agency promulgating the rule must conduct an initial and final regulatory flexibility analysis. Unfortunately, this requirement is largely ignored on only half completed by the agencies. For example, a report from the National Federation of Independent Businesses found that in 75% of rulemakings, the SBA determined that federal agencies either ignored costs on small business or underestimated the regulations cost. Let me provide an ongoing example of this issue and how the Prove It Act would remedy the situation. Currently, we are opposing an Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, proposed rule which would mandate the electronic surveillance of our nation's herds of cattle and bison. APHIS completed a brief two-page initial RFA analysis which found that, using the Small Business Administration's guidelines, that the majority of cattle operations in the United States are considered small. So in fact, this regulation would fall directly on them. After acknowledging that the proposed rule would almost entirely impact small businesses, the agency then wrote off these concerns with outdated and incorrect data. This entire analysis spans just 2 pages, is from nearly 2 years ago, and relies on the undervalued cost estimate of the proposed rule created by APHIS, an estimate which APHIS has not publicly shown how it was calculated. Just to give you an example of how important this particular issue is to our cattle and bison producers, in 2013, APHIS estimated that an RFID requirement would cost between $1.2 and $1.9 billion, primarily against our small cattle producers. In 2019, they estimated that the cost would be $35 million, and they did so by ignoring the vast majority of costs associated with implementing an RFID mandate. And in 2024, they've reduced that number even further, down to $26 million, again by ignoring almost all of the costs associated with implementing an RFID mandate. This is what these agencies do. When they do their analysis, they do everything in their power to try to underestimate the costs that are actually going to be borne by the regulated community. If APHIS's rule was finalized, it appears that APHIS would be on track to try to get around the final analysis requirements that it is currently required to comply with, and impose one of the most costly regulations against our cattle and bison producers in the history of the United States, all while ignoring their responsibility to report these details and actually provide a valid economic analysis. It would also give a voice. Under the Prove It Act, the reasonably foreseeable indirect cost analysis would have forced the agency to consider the additional cost burdens it is currently ignoring under this rule, such as the cost of the wands. Right now, the $26 million is just strictly the button in the ear. It does not include all of the related computer equipment, all of the wands, the retrofitting for our livestock producers that would be necessary to implement this rule. That's how they come up with $26 million versus the $1.2 billion that they estimated 11 years ago. APHIS, if they had to comply with the Prove It Act, they would actually have to disclose the impact on the entire country through such mandate on our food producers. It would also give a voice to the ranchers and organizations which represent them to point out the obvious flaws in APHIS's proposal, flaws which myself and other ranching groups have been petitioning with OIRA. The shortcomings in the proposal stem from the agency's lack of industry expertise and create a real challenge, would be challenged under the Prove It Act's empowering of small businesses to challenge the findings in the initial regulatory flexibility analysis. It should not have to be this way, and agencies must be held accountable for violating federal law to the detriment of America's small businesses. The Prove It Act merely updates and strengthens a law already on the books to the benefit of America's small businesses. I'm proud to co-sponsor this legislation. I think it's extremely important to be protecting our small businesses from regulatory and federal overreach. The question of how much extra work it would be for these agencies to have to comply, my response to that is then perhaps they would be a bit more judicious in their efforts to overregulate our small businesses And in fact, all of our businesses. Perhaps they would use their resources better in actually adopting regulations that were necessary rather than simply doing what they do now, which is over-regulating every community, every business and industry in the country. So I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of this incredibly important bill. One other statistic that I think is important is that on average, agencies underestimate the cost of their regulations by 40%. So to the extent that any agency identifies a regulation as being significant, meaning it will have an economic impact of over $100 million, you can assume that the actual economic impact of that regulation is $140 million. All we're attempting to do with this regulation is force the agencies to be more accurate in their calculations of the impact on our small businesses. I also would hope that we would have bipartisan support for this. Again, it's a good governance and transparency bill that I think is in the best interest of our small businesses across this country. Defining costs as indirect is one of the ways in which the agencies hide what an actual cost of a regulation will be. And I will again use the example of the RFID requirement. The radio frequency identification is a button or an ear tag placed in the ear of either the cattle or the bison that are being herded. But all of that button or that ear tag is absolutely irrelevant and does nothing unless you have all of the related equipment to be able to read that ear tag. So you're going to have the wand, you're going to have the computer equipment, you're going to have the software, you're going to have to be able to be handling the cattle and bison to actually put the ear tag on. So all of those costs are identified as indirect costs because they're not the actual RFID, but they absolutely are a cost associated with that regulation. It is getting at the indirect cost that is so important, and it's why the Prove It Act, again, is a good governance bill based upon transparency and accountability, because it is forcing the agencies to actually disclose to the American public the real cost of their regulations on small businesses. In light of the importance of small businesses to the economic powerhouse that the United States is, I would think everyone would want to know what the cost of these regulations are.